Sometimes mortal enemies can become best friends, such as the United States and Vietnam. For most people, when you think about Vietnam and the United States, this is the image that comes to your head. Helicopters, soldiers fighting for battles, jungle warfare, tunnel rats. But now things have changed, where Vietnam and the United States, they did sort of rekindle their relationship economically. Now we're going into a military friendship. You see, in times of desperation, sometimes two enemies end up becoming friends, or at least two people who never really had anything in common. We can sort of see this with Russia and China. A really big misconception is that Russia and China have always been close allies. When you really think about it, though, they have absolutely nothing in common, and they only really became stronger allies ever since the war in Ukraine and more political and geopolitical pressures on China. That's how Russia and China became friends, and that's sort of how Vietnam and the United States are becoming friends. Now, for those of you who are not aware, President Biden did end up going to Vietnam, Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, where there was an arms deal put on the table. And Vietnam says, we accept. We want one of the largest arms deals in the history of a post-Soviet era country between the United States. Now, we don't have an exact idea of what the total package is going to be, but we do know that there's going to be the sale or a fleet of American F-16 fighter jets. Now, again, it sounds oddly familiar. Oh yeah, Ukraine. Now, this is a massive deal, and there are some massive implications here because, again, understand the last time we had any sort of military connection with Vietnam was during the Vietnam War, and China and Vietnam, they sort of had their run of conflicts. Again, I'm sure many of you don't even know this. There was something called the Sino-Vietnamese War that lasted about 3 weeks. China said they won. Vietnam said they won. Essentially, China invaded Vietnam for 3 weeks, and they got really close to the capital and said, we're done. But of course, they were done when Vietnam deployed literally every single Vietnamese troop and they were ready to do battle. And this was in 1979. Again, you had a lot of Vietnamese veterans who are combat hardened. So again, both countries said they won, but that ended up working in both of the countries' favors. And because both of these countries won, they were able to come to the table in the 90s and essentially become economical partners. But so did the United States. So again, China and Vietnam, they've always been rather cordial. Understand they are border nations. So what exactly is happening? Well, China is doing what they're doing to Vietnam that they do to every single country in the region. China is essentially bullying Vietnam along with the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, where China is essentially creating their own arbitrary bubble around the Parcel Islands. Now, Vietnam claims that we've had control of the Parcels for hundreds of years, like historically speaking, way longer than China. China says, nope, these are our territories, and you can see these red lines right here. This is the border that China conveniently created that blocks everybody else off from the islands, the parcels. Now, of course, Vietnam says this northern portion and the southern portion here, these are our islands, and China says, nope, these are our islands. And because of this, China has made it a way bigger deal than they've need to. And so Vietnam is looking to the United States for a potential military partner because when you look at the region over here, who else could take on China? Now, the other really big implication, and there's sort of a rumor stemming up that Vietnam, although yes, they do want to purchase from the United States, there was a letter uncovered, we don't know if verified or unverified, from Vietnam that they still do want to purchase mass amounts of technology and rifles from Russia. As you can see here, these are all the countries who purchase from Russia, and Vietnam pulls in 5.9% of imports from Russia arms and like technology. So that's going to be another big issue where when you start to mix in Soviet era technology and you start to mix in US technology, it becomes a massive conflict of interest because we can also assume that China has a big deal in this as well. Now, while we're at it, we might as well take a look at a video of President Biden in Vietnam. Everyone's calling it a historic visit because, again, we sort of struck a deal when it comes to the military. And I'll tell you this right now, China would be in really big trouble if Vietnam allows for the United States to come onto their territory because now China has the United States right at their border.
Visits to Vietnam on Sunday. U.S. President Joe Biden secured deals on semiconductors and minerals as the strategic Southeast Asian nation promoted Washington to Hanoi's top-tier diplomatic status alongside China and Russia. The U.S. has been pushing for the upgrade for months with a strategic nation in the contested Indo-Pacific region.
Today, we can trace 50-year arc of progress in the relationship between our nations from conflict to normalization.
Now, again, this has been 50 years in the making. What most people don't realize is that in the 90s, the United States already did sort of strike a deal with Vietnam where we are going to become economic partners. But Vietnam has $90 billion worth of trade between the United States and Vietnam. So we are really strong partners. But it looks here the United States is elevating Vietnam to a new status, to a status of we support you guys and whatever you need, we got you. Because it looks like if Vietnam is willing to work with the United States as far as a military capacity, and for everyone to fight against one common enemy, China, not necessarily directly, but to show if everyone comes together and we all show China that we are willing to work together, that's a massive move from the Vietnamese and the United States to come together, especially when this was the last time, the conflict of the Vietnam War, it ended very bad and it was very destructive for everyone. So this is very historic. Now, understand this, China creates their own man-made islands, and what they do is they place military bases there. So if an island seems to feel like they're being threatened, they can now instigate a war and legally through international law say, well, we felt threatened and we have the right to defend ourselves. Now, it makes total sense as to why Vietnam would want F-16 fighter jets to potentially bring the fight away from Vietnam and over to these islands. And now, I know it seems silly, like these islands are very insignificant, but nonetheless, if China put like the smallest little buoy in the water and they do that and you mess with it, you may have possibly instigated a war with China, or they might do something really sketchy, either economically or through their military power. So again, it makes total sense as to why Vietnam wants better aircraft. They're not known for their air force. They're known to be very tough fighters, but nonetheless, Vietnam hasn't really had an armed conflict since the late 70s with China in that 3-week period. Now, I know some of you are asking, is this all really worth it? Like, why are we helping Vietnam guard some of these islands in the threat of like a World War III or Vietnam getting instigated into another war? Well, it sort of is. So there's two theories out there, just so you are aware. You have Taiwan and Australia. Theory number one is that China is trying to create this massive buffer zone, and it even makes sense because you can see this fake red line that China has created where if China attacks Taiwan, there's no way for them to get flanked from the south, from the Philippines, from Vietnam, because the United States does have assets down here in the South China Sea and in the surrounding waters. As far as going further south into Australia, the Japanese sort of took the same approach of cutting through all of these islands, having their own natural barriers and defense, and not being out in the open sea. And what people are thinking, Australia and a lot of military analysts, to include the United States, is that China's main objective is to eventually go to Australia and have their own little like colony secluded in Australia, because Australia really is strategically important and they are rather protected. They're almost like their own little United States, just segregated from the rest of the world. So again, that's what many people think, and that's why I think that we should be in the South China Sea and we should be partnering with Vietnam, with the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, all of these people to fight together and to not let China bully everyone, because if you continue to let China bully everyone, they're going to do what they're already doing to the Philippines. They're just cutting them off. They're creating fake fences, floating buoys in the water and saying, this is our territory. And to be honest with you, Vietnam, you don't really hear them or see them in the news too much because Vietnam is actually a rather peaceful nation. But at the same time, they know that they really can't do too much against China. So to partner with the United States, that's a good thing. And I want to finish with this. We don't know necessarily what this military cooperation is going to be other than trading of arms, but we do understand this, that if Vietnam does buy F-16s, that does open the door for U.S. military cooperation, because when you purchase really high-tech stuff like this, you don't just buy the F-16s and they're like, okay, have fun. You have a training program. You work with the United States to see like how to actually fly those things beyond training, but like proper tactics. This is what we do with Ukraine. We did it with Israel. And so again, this does open the door where if Vietnam does like how this all went, who's to say they're not going to buy some Bradley fighting vehicles or buy some Abrams tanks and so on. So again, this is going to open the door for Vietnam. And I think ultimately what the United States needs and wants is for either U.S. Marines or U.S. Army to be stationed in Vietnam or have some sort of air base, because then we would be the official blockade to the Chinese. That would be massive. Beyond having troops in the Philippines, and even that's a little sketchy because the Philippines, they like us, but we've had a bit of a sketchy past. For Vietnam to allow the United States there, again, the ultimate blocking position, and Australia would be forever grateful to us for pretty much saving Australia. But nonetheless, yeah, that's what I think the final outcome is going to be. The United States having boots on the ground in Vietnam. Nonetheless, this is very historic, and it's crazy to think that we went from this all the way up until 2023, really strong economic partners. But not only that, it looks like we're going to be really strong military partners as well.